In this video, I'm going to build a side table that fits in this little entry area to match the bedroom set from previous videos. Let's get right into it. For this project, I'm mainly using poplar since it'll be painted, and then ash for the top to match the other furniture I've made in this set. I was more excited than usual to start this project because I finally got in the second piece to complete my new rough lumber milling arsenal. This is the new Laguna JX8 joiner to pair up with the PX16 planer I've been using the past several months. I'll have an in-depth video coming up just going over both of these machines, but quickly, this is the 220 volt 3 horsepower version, which also has the ShearTech cutter head. This beast is a huge upgrade in size, with the cast iron bed being just over 6 feet long, and it also has an additional pull-out roller support on the infeed side. As heavy as this thing is, I was surprised, and you could see how easy it was to move with the built-in wheels. Of course, by the JX8 name, it's the 8-inch wide cutter head with 6 rows and 54 of the 4-sided carbide inserts. I also got to realize a perk of upgrading to an 8-inch joiner right away on this first project when making up the top panel. With my old, smaller joiner, I would have had to use 3 boards to make the top, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but by having the larger capacity I could do it with only 2 boards, and the least amount of seams and variations between different boards is always a good thing. On this first day, the only pieces I'm actually taking down to final thickness are the 2 boards for the top panel, and everything else I'm just doing an initial milling to square everything up, and then I'll let the pieces rest since I knew I wouldn't get back to working on this for several days. I mainly just wanted to get my glue ups done this first day so they'd have plenty of time to completely dry. I also had to glue sets of 2 boards together to make up the thicker blanks for the legs. I just did this all at once, of course making sure not to glue the different sets of 2 boards together in the same clamps. Several days later, when I got back to working on this, I first took the 4 legs out of clamps and started getting them squared back up and planed down to their final thickness. Once the legs were cut to their final size, next I added in the cove detail. Again, these details are pretty similar to the rest of the set, which I have videos on if you haven't already checked them out. This time I wised up and clamped all 4 legs together to make the process way faster and used a 12-inch speed square as my router guide. I typically use these for rough construction where complete accuracy isn't crucial, but for something like this you just want to make sure your square is actually square, which out of the 3 I have, this is the only one that truly was. To make the cove, I used this Freud 3/8 radius round nose router bit. By clamping the legs like this, I could make a pass on one face, then flip the whole thing over and do the other side. Then I only had to redo the clamps once and rotate all the legs to do the other 2 faces. With that done, next I started working on adding the tapers. I only tapered the 2 outside faces on each leg, so to eliminate any mistakes I went ahead and lined the legs up how I wanted and marked which faces to cut. It'd really be a bummer to mess up and do a wrong side with this much work already put into them. I knew this project was on the docket, so I saved my quick and dirty tapering jig from the other builds, except on this one the tapers were much longer so the fence and clamps needed to be adjusted. The pieces were just brad nailed on, so I simply unscrewed the clamps and then pried them off. Then I took the plywood and made a new cut edge on the table saw. This dimension really doesn't matter, I'm just establishing my fence location so when I rerun the jig through, it's cutting right on the edge of the plywood. Then I can line up a leg on the jig where I want it to be cut, which is a 1/4 inch in on the bottom of the leg, and then taper out right at the bottom of the cove detail. With the legs set where I want it, I nail on some new scrap pieces to act as my repeatable fence. Eventually I'll make a jig that is more easily adjustable, but today isn't that day and this works just fine and only took a minute. I really like the detail these subtle tapers add, as opposed to everything just being square. With the tapers done, I then rounded over all the edges with just a small 1/8 inch round over bit. The last detail the legs needed were the threaded inserts and leveling feet. It's generally a good idea to add these because no matter how perfect your build is, the floor it's sitting on a lot of times isn't. Now that the legs were completely done, I could finish milling up the rest of the material. Overall, it's a good practice not to take your pieces down to their final size unless you plan on putting them together relatively soon. In my case, it had been several days, so after the initial milling and exposing new grain, the pieces could absorb or release moisture and potentially move again. Since I already squared up all the pieces to start, my simple test is to just stack all the boards up. If they lay together nicely, I just finish taking them to their final thickness on the planer. But in my case this time, some of the boards had gaps in between them and rocked back and forth and stuff like that. So that told me I needed to go ahead and run them on the joiner quickly to take out any cups or twists first. Really, it's a pretty cool experiment, an example of how wood moves too, because like I said, after the initial milling, all my pieces were perfect and stacked together flawlessly, and then only after a few days later they weren't. With all my pieces cut to size, I then started working on the front face frame. To connect the pieces, I drilled pocket holes on the back side of all the drawer divider pieces. In my plans, which I do have linked below if you're interested, I originally planned on joining all the other pieces with dowels. But as I was working, I thought how much of a pain that would be to try and clamp all this together, especially with how long it is. So while I had the pocket hole jig out, I made the decision to go ahead and just use that for all the other pieces as well. Anytime I'm making up a frame like this, I like to go ahead and cut a piece of scrap to length to use as a divider to make sure all the openings are the exact same size. Before assembling everything, I first go through the hole sanding process, which on this is only up to 150 grit since it's being painted. I also rounded over all the exposed edges with the same 1/8 inch bit as before. To center the pieces on the legs, I added some scrap 3/4 inch material underneath, added glue, and then clamped the pieces up so they wouldn't move and got them joined together with the pocket hole screws. When it came time to add the front legs, this 90-degree attachment really came in handy. The bottom shelf supports was much of the same, and I used some more scraps to set the pieces on to make sure they were all the same height. For the bottom shelf, I decided to use MDF for a few different reasons. First, I had like the perfect size of scrap on hand to use, and MDF paints up really smooth. But also, since I'd be trapping it inside the legs, using something like MDF, which is super stable, I wouldn't have to worry about the panel trying to expand or contract with humidity. The one downside is that the edges really like to soak in primer and paint, so off camera I went ahead and did a couple coats of primer so they'd end up nice and smooth when finishing with the rest at the end. In between coats of the primer drying, I next started working on the wooden drawer runners. With how small the drawers are and just a classic feel of the build overall, I felt some traditional wood runners would fit a lot better than some store-bought metal slides that would eat up several inches of space. The runners are just 3 pieces glued and screwed in the shape of a U. The drawer will slide on the bottom piece, the top piece will keep the drawer from tilting up, and then the middle piece will keep the drawer from racking side to side. And you can see I drilled pocket holes on the tops and bottoms to install them so they wouldn't be seen at the end. After getting the runner slid into place, you can see the U shape is flush on the inside of the face frame on all 3 sides. These runners also had the unintended benefit of really solidifying the whole table and eliminating any racking. With a fast drying primer, at this point the bottom shelf was ready to be installed. I don't know about you, but when it comes to cutting notches like this, it's usually hard to get all four to fit perfect without gaps or being too tight and racking the piece trying to get it in. So sometimes I'll try to insert it before fully adding the other pieces together, which adds another challenge in itself. But even a blind squirrel finds a nut sometimes, and I couldn't have asked for a better fit on all four of these notches. Since MDF tends to mushroom up when you nail it and makes it a lot harder to fill the holes to make them completely disappear, I just clamped the shelf on to allow the glue to dry. With that drying, I moved on to making the drawer boxes. I already had my pieces cut to size, so all I had to do was add the groove on the inside on all four pieces for the bottom panel. I just did this in a couple passes until the groove was wide enough for the plywood panel. To join the pieces, I once again used pocket holes like I typically do on my drawers, since it's so quick and easy, and it's just such a clean look since you can't see any visible fasteners at the end. But since I took my parts for these down to a thickness of 5/8, I switched over to the micro insert so I could use the smaller Kreg screws. Lastly was making the false drawer fronts. I'm using 3/4 inch material for these for stability, but to lighten the look I created a rabbet on all four sides so the drawer front would actually recess into the table a bit. The inner dimensions of the rabbet end up being the exact same size as the drawer box, and then the top rabbet is a little bigger than the bottom, so once it's attached to the box, it has the same reveal along all four sides on the face frame. I really like how much this softened up the look. Next I got all the holes drilled for the drawer pulls and rounded over the edges. One more thing I could do before finishing was cutting the slots to attach the top with Z-clip fasteners. Barely had enough to get the biscuit joiner in there to cut these. Another option if you don't have a biscuit joiner is to run these pieces through the table saw to make the groove before assembly. I like this style of fastener because it allows the solid wood top to move in either direction, in and out or side to side depending on which edge it's on. With the base completely ready for finish, next I took the top panel out of clamps and got it trimmed down to final size. I used General Finishes gray gel stain, which is by far the most expensive stain I've used, but a good gray is such a tough color to find, and this is definitely my favorite that I've tried. After the bottom dried for a while, I came back out later that night to coat the top and edges, but I was in my pajamas, so no need to turn the camera on for that. For the top coat on the panel, I used shellac. This panel is a bit larger than I'd like to wipe the shellac on, and not really big enough to set up the HVLP for, so a simple rattle can does the trick on a panel this size. On the base, I first used Chem Aqua Surfacer and sprayed it on with my Graco 9.5 HVLP. I only filmed the first coat because it gets pretty boring and hard to see after that, but after 2 coats of the surfacer, I then did 2 coats of General Finishes white poly. One more thing I realized I needed to button up on the drawers was a way to prevent them from pulling all the way out. I simply cut a small piece of wood to screw on the back of the drawer box, Then it could be rotated up after installing the drawer and it would hit the back of the face frame, keeping it from falling all the way out. Next, I could get the false drawer front attached to the box and then use the hole I already drilled as a guide to finish drilling all the way through and install the drawer pull. The last thing to do was getting the top panel attached using those Z-clip fasteners. Alright, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the process. Like I said, the full plans are linked below if you'd like to build this yourself, along with all the tools and materials used in the video. Of course, I'd really appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Until next time, take care.